Across the rain-soaked hills of northern England, along the stone villages of Scotland and the small coastal communities of Wales, there are houses for sale for less than £100,000, and yet, nobody buys them. It isn't a lack of beauty. Many of them hold original fireplaces, centuries-old oak beams and stone walls that have withstood generations. The problem, more often than not, is hidden in the details: roofs that need replacing, foundations that require attention, or simply a geographic isolation that keeps away buyers looking for modern convenience. Throughout this documentary, we'll walk through 5 of these properties scattered across the United Kingdom, understand exactly why they've stayed on the market for months, sometimes years, and what each one reveals about the changes taking place in the British countryside, in the cost of rural living, and in how people today decide where they want to live. At first glance, it looks like just another simple little house on the edge of a historic town, surrounded by well-tended gardens and a quiet that already hints at the kind of life lived there. But this small property holds a particularity that largely explains why it's still on the market after months. The house sits inside Nidderdale Lodge Park, a residential park exclusively for residents over 50, on the outskirts of Knaresborough, in the heart of North Yorkshire. That alone changes the whole picture. This isn't a stone house with its own foundation and independent plot of land, but a single-story home of the kind known here as a park home, built within a gated community with an age restriction for anyone wishing to live there. The facade is simple and well kept, in light tones, with a pitched roof that resembles a compact cabin. Out front, a small garden has been tended with care, trimmed shrubs, a wooden arbor already showing a few years of age, and flower beds that, depending on the season, fill with color. It's the kind of garden that reveals a present owner, someone who liked spending mornings out there, watering plants and watching neighbors go by. Inside, the space is modest: 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, and a living room that also serves as the dining area, adding up to just over 43 square meters. There are no exposed oak beams here, no centuries-old fireplaces, no stone floors worn down by time, the features that usually draw people dreaming of a traditional British country home. The logic here is different: practicality, low maintenance costs, and a single floor, designed to make life easier for older residents. And that's precisely what partly explains why the house remains on the market. Park homes like this one aren't conventional properties. Whoever buys the house doesn't buy the land beneath it, the land belongs to the park, and the resident pays a monthly charge, known as a pitch fee, to keep the unit in place. That drastically narrows the pool of interested buyers. Banks are often reluctant to lend on this type of property, and the age restriction automatically rules out young families, investors, and anyone under 50. Knaresborough, the town surrounding this small residential park, is one of the oldest and most charming places in North Yorkshire. Its history stretches back to the Anglo-Saxon period, and the local market, one of the oldest in England, has existed since around 1206, having received its royal charter in 1310, which means that every Wednesday, traders still fill the town's central square, repeating a ritual that spans more than 700 years. The town rises above a limestone gorge carved by the River Nid, with a castle founded as early as 1070, now in ruins, but still standing on the cliff, looking out over the valley below. Living in Knaresborough means living somewhere that seems to have deliberately slowed down. The narrow streets of the historic centre, the traditional cafes, the railway viaduct crossing the river, and the antique shops all form a backdrop of quiet living, ideal for anyone seeking calm without giving up convenience. The town is only about half an hour from Leeds and York. It's exactly that kind of peaceful, history-steeped life that Nidderdale Lodge Park promises its residents: a small, quiet refuge inside a town carrying centuries of memory. The asking price for this property is £79,950, a figure that, at first glance, seems surprisingly low for such a sought-after part of Yorkshire. But it's exactly this contrast between a desirable location and an unconventional property format that keeps this house waiting, month after month, for the right buyer. If this first property already shows how much a low price can conceal important particularities, the next one takes us to a completely different setting, where the reason behind the reduced value is something else entirely. At first glance, this one doesn't even look like a house waiting to be sold. It looks like something freshly unwrapped, sitting on a bed of trimmed grass surrounded by mature trees, almost too new for the story we're used to telling. And in a way, that's exactly the point of this property. Unlike the weathered stone farmhouses that usually anchor these documentaries, this is something built for a completely different purpose. This is a brand new 2026 model Willoughby Salisbury holiday home, set within a residential leisure park in Newton-le-Willows, just outside Bedale, in North Yorkshire. It isn't a house in the traditional sense at all, no foundation sunk into the earth, no centuries of families passing through its rooms. It's a manufactured lodge, delivered whole and lowered onto its plot, designed for holiday and leisure occupancy rather than as someone's permanent, everyday home. The exterior is finished in soft grey cladding, with a covered timber veranda and a small staircase leading up to the front door, the kind of understated design that leisure park manufacturers favour: clean lines, large windows, and a low-maintenance composite deck that never needs painting or replacing. Inside, the layout offers 2 bedrooms, built around open-plan living, with the kind of contemporary finish more associated with a serviced apartment than with a Yorkshire farmhouse, fitted kitchen units, integrated appliances, and furnishings included as standard. What immediately sets this property apart from the others in this documentary is what it represents legally and practically. A holiday lodge like this one typically comes with restrictions. Many parks only permit occupancy for a set number of months each year, ban permanent residency altogether, and require an annual site fee on top of the purchase price, sometimes running into several £1,000s a year. Buyers can't simply move in and call it home the way they would with a conventional cottage. That single detail dramatically narrows the pool of people who are actually able to buy it, no matter how attractive the price looks on paper. And the setting around it does everything it can to make up for that. Newton-le-Willows sits just a few miles from Bedale, a market town whose story stretches back to the Domesday Book, when the land was held by a lord named Thorfinn before the Norman conquest reshaped the north of England entirely. Bedale received its market charter in 1251, and the town's layout, arranged around its long, sloping marketplace, has barely changed since. At its northern end stands Bedale Hall, a Georgian mansion built where a medieval castle once stood, and nearby the 14th century Market Cross still marks the spot where the town's 3 original streets converge, a monument old enough to have been listed as a scheduled site since 1936. Life around Bedale moves at the pace of the Yorkshire Dales, which begin almost at the town's edge. Locals still gather for the weekly market, walkers use the town as a gateway into Wensleydale and Swaledale, and the heritage line of the Wensleydale Railway still calls at Bedale's own station, a slower, older way of moving through this part of the country. It's a landscape of dry stone walls, sheep pasture, and wooded river valleys, the kind of setting people dream about when they imagine owning a getaway in the English countryside, even if, in this particular case, what's for sale isn't quite a house at all. The asking price sits at £64,995, a number that looks almost implausibly low for a brand new build in the Yorkshire Dales, until the fine print of leisure home ownership comes into focus, and it becomes clear why the comparison to a traditional country home only goes so far. If the reason this one lingers on the market lies in what it legally is, the next property carries a completely different kind of complication, one written not into its paperwork, but into its very walls. At first glance, this one blends almost perfectly into the woodland around it, its timber cladding catching the same tones as the trees pressing in on every side, a small wooden deck stepping down toward a patch of open lawn. It has the quiet, tucked-away feel of a cabin retreat rather than a house someone was ever meant to live in permanently, and that impression turns out to be exactly right. This is the Delta Hideaway, a static holiday lodge inside Ingmire Holiday Park, just outside Sedbergh, within the Yorkshire Dales National Park. Like the previous property, it's a leisure lodge rather than a conventional dwelling, no chimney breast holding centuries of heat, no thick stone walls settled into the ground, just a timber-framed structure fitted out for weekends and holidays rather than everyday domestic life. 2 bedrooms sit inside, arranged around a compact living and kitchen area, with large windows angled to pull in the surrounding tree line and the sound of the beck running somewhere close by. The veranda out front, built from pale timber decking with a simple balustrade, wraps around enough of the lodge to suggest quiet evenings spent outside rather than inside, the kind of feature designed for looking at the landscape rather than escaping it. And the landscape here does a great deal of the talking. Sedbergh sits at the meeting point of 4 rivers, beneath the looming, rounded shoulders of the Howgill Fells, hills the writer and fellwalker Alfred Wainwright once compared to sleeping elephants and counted among his favourites in the whole of northern England. The town appears in the Domesday Book, and shortly after the Norman conquest, a timber motte and bailey castle was raised at nearby Castlehore to help the new Norman lords assert control over the valley, its earthworks still visible today above the town. What makes Sedbergh unusual, though, has less to do with castles and more to do with books. After the foot-and-mouth disease outbreak of 2001 devastated the local farming economy and, with it, the flow of visitors the town depended on, the community reinvented itself, launching Sedbergh Book Town in 2003 to draw people back through literature rather than livestock. Today the narrow, cobbled streets hold half a dozen bookshops, including Westwood Books, whose 2 floors hold more than 70,000 volumes, an improbable, almost eccentric identity for a town of under 3,000 people, tucked so far into the western edge of the Dales that it technically sits in Cumbria rather than Yorkshire at all. That contradiction, a Yorkshire Dales landscape administered from Cumbria, is part of what makes the setting feel so layered, and it's the same contradiction that runs through the lodge itself. Ingmire Holiday Park sits inside a national park, surrounded by protected fells, dry stone walls, and grazing sheep, offering exactly the kind of view people imagine when they picture retiring to the English countryside. But like the Willoughby Lodge before it, this Delta hideaway typically comes bound to a holiday use license, seasonal restrictions on occupancy, an annual site fee, and, in most cases, no right to make it a full-time home. It's a property built for escape, not for settling down, and that single distinction keeps its pool of buyers narrower than the postcard views around it would ever suggest. The asking price is £64,995, the same figure as the lodge in Bedale, and, once again, a number that only makes sense once the nature of the ownership becomes clear. 2 lodges, 2 national parks, 2 prices that look almost identical on paper, and yet each one carries its own quiet reason for waiting. If wooden lodges tucked into holiday parks explain 2 of these listings, the next property takes us back to something altogether older, a structure that has stood through centuries rather than seasons, and whose story is written into stone rather than timber cladding. At first glance, this one looks almost suspiciously ordinary, a long, cream-colored park home tucked among trees, a red postbox standing sentinel near the entrance, the whole scene wrapped in that specific stillness that only very small, very remote places seem to have. But of everything examined so far, this is the one whose price alone stops the search dead, £25,000 for 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, a figure so low it almost reads like a misprint. The property sits within Bowland Fell Park, a residential park near the hamlet of Teesside, on the border between North Yorkshire and Lancashire, literally on the border, in fact, since Teesside is one of the rare English villages split between 2 counties, with the eastern half falling under Yorkshire and the western half under Lancashire. This is a detached, single-story park home, offering 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms across an open-plan layout of nearly 46 square meters, freehold, and currently listed for sale by auction rather than through a standard sale process. That last detail matters more than it might seem. An auction listing changes the entire dynamic of a sale. Instead of negotiating a price over weeks or months, buyers commit to a fixed date, often with a legal pack to review in advance and a requirement to complete the purchase within a tight window, sometimes as little as 28 days. It's a route typically used for properties that need to move quickly, or that carry some complication a conventional buyer might hesitate over, anything from title issues to a park home's ground lease. Combined with the age and leisure restrictions that frequently apply to park homes similar to the ones already seen in this documentary, it's easy to understand why this listing, despite its size and freehold status, remains priced so far below anything resembling the regional average. And the region around it has a story worth knowing. Tosside's name descends from Old Norse, a fusion of the words for fox and high summer pasture, a linguistic fossil left behind by Viking settlers who once grazed livestock on these same hills more than 1,000 years ago. The village sits within the Forest of Bowland, a landscape that carries the word forest in its old, technical sense, not a stretch of woodland, but a royal hunting ground, one of 5 such forests once reserved for deer and wild boar under the Earls of Lancaster during the medieval period. Bowland was designated an area of outstanding natural beauty in 1964, and today the same fells once patrolled for royal game are grazed by sheep and crossed by walkers heading toward Stocks Reservoir and the River Hodder. Life in Teesside moves at a scale almost impossible to picture from a city, barely more than 150 residents, spread across a hillside village where a 17th-century church still holds Sunday services, and the nearest proper shopping trip means driving into Settle or Skipton. It's the kind of place where a single country inn becomes the center of the community, where cyclists pass through on their way to the forest trails at Gisborne, and where a red post box outside a park home can genuinely be the closest thing to a village landmark. It's remote in the truest sense of the word, and it's precisely that remoteness, beautiful, but demanding for anyone dependent on daily conveniences, that keeps prices here so far below what the surrounding scenery might otherwise suggest. At £25,000, this is by far the least expensive property in this documentary, and once the picture comes together, an auction sale, a leasehold park setting, and one of the most isolated corners of Bowland, the number stops looking like a mistake and starts looking like exactly what it is: the price of space, freedom from a mortgage, and a very particular kind of solitude. If isolation explains why this property sits at the very bottom of the price range, the next one flips that logic entirely, showing how a location can be just as isolating even when the price tag suggests otherwise. At first glance, this one looks like the finished, polished version of everything seen so far: dark timber cladding instead of pale, a glass balustrade instead of painted wood, a wraparound deck facing straight out toward open fields and a distant line of fells. It reads less like a caravan park lodge and more like something out of a boutique retreat brochure. And yet, of all 5 properties in this documentary, this is the one that has sat on the market the longest. This luxury lodge is once again located near Sedbergh, within the Yorkshire Dales National Park, though on a different, more exclusive development than the wooden hideaway examined earlier. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a single open reception room make up the interior, finished to a noticeably higher specification, darker wood tones, larger glazing, and a covered veranda substantial enough to function as an outdoor room in its own right, looking directly across grazing pasture toward the silhouette of the Howgill Fells in the distance. Structurally, it belongs to the same family as the lodges already seen, a manufactured leisure home rather than a traditionally built house, still subject to the same holiday use licenses, seasonal restrictions, and annual site fees that typically apply to this kind of property. But what sets this listing apart isn't its construction. It's the date. This lodge was first listed in March of 2024, which means that, by the time this documentary was made, it had already been sitting unsold for well over 2 years, quietly labeled online as a hidden gem, an odd description for something that's been publicly available, and seemingly overlooked, for so long. That contradiction says something honest about how these leisure lodge listings actually behave in the market. A £95,000 price tag positions this property well above the other lodges already featured, competing not just with other holiday homes but, at that price point, with small conventional cottages that come without license restrictions at all. For a buyer weighing the two, a lodge that can't be lived in year-round and carries an ongoing site fee on top of the purchase price becomes a harder sell than the number alone suggests, no matter how handsome the finish or how spectacular the view from the deck. And the view earns its reputation honestly. Sedbergh, a scene already through the Delta Hideaway, sits where 4 rivers converge beneath the Howgill Fells, hills so distinctive that Alfred Wainwright placed them among his personal favourites in a lifetime spent walking the north of England. The town's reinvention as England's book town after the foot-and-mouth crisis of 2001 gave it a second identity entirely separate from its farming past, drawing in visitors for its cobbled lanes and second-hand bookshops as much as for its scenery. A lodge like this one sits at the edge of all of it, close enough to walk into town for a browse through Westwood books or a pot of tea, far enough to spend an evening on the veranda with nothing but sheep and fell for company. At £95,000, this is the most expensive property in this documentary, and in many ways the most quietly telling. It shows that price alone was never the deciding factor in any of these 5 listings. Location, restriction, structure, and timing all shape whether a property finds a buyer, sometimes far more than the number printed at the top of the page ever could. 5 very different properties, and 5 very different reasons for staying unsold. A house inside a residential park on the edge of a 700-year-old market town, ruled out by an age restriction few buyers can meet. A brand new holiday lodge in the heart of the Yorkshire Dales, held back by the fine print of leisure use ownership. A second lodge, within the same national park, carrying the same quiet limitations behind an even more polished finish. A remote 3-bedroom home on the Lancashire border, priced low enough to raise eyebrows once the auction terms and the isolation of the place come into focus. And finally, a luxury lodge that proves even the best finished property can sit waiting for years, when the right conditions simply never align. Together, these 5 properties sketch out a portrait of the United Kingdom far more layered than any asking price alone could ever tell: the market towns of North Yorkshire, the valleys and fells of the Dales, and the forgotten corners where England and its price tags don't always agree. The lesson is that Britain's cheapest homes are rarely cheap by accident, and that behind every listing sitting stagnant on the market, there's always a story written between the lines, not just in the photographs. If one of these 5 properties stuck with you in a particular way, it's worth saying so in the comments, which one, and why. And if this kind of journey through Britain's overlooked corners is one you'd like to keep taking, subscribe to the channel, because the next British region is already being prepared, with new stories, new houses, and new hidden reasons behind every price.